60 minutes, I would like to give a bit of an overview to just sort of set the stage for which part of the topic that is alluded to in this session we're going to try to cover in the next 55 minutes. Then I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves and say a little bit about their perspective on the topic. And then we will have a hopefully somewhat structured discussion amongst the panelists before opening up to the floor for further discussion. So that's the theory. I should at least tell you who the panelists are in case you haven't been paying attention. We have Glenn Dean, Leif Hansen, and Peter St. Andre on our panel. I'm sure you know some or all of them quite well and are anticipating a very lively discussion, as I am. All right, so enough of the preliminaries. What are we here for? So, as we all know, currently the internet supports publication in the sense of making stuff available, and it's been very effective at that in any number of ways for several decades. You might actually have access control to resource, but in essence, the culture is once you've got your digital fingers wrapped around a piece of content, that's it. You know, you're off the races. You can and will do whatever you want with it, pretty much as per your own wishes. Whatever you do or don't do, or whether you should or should not do it, is a matter completely outside the realm of the internet. This can cause some surprises sometimes. It's not just about big content. This is not just about, recording musicians not making money, or it's not just about, Hollywood movies. It's also a question of you. Yes, you are a publisher. It would be interesting to know just where this cat picture is going to wind up by the end of the day. Certainly, I don't know. I'm kind of curious what words might get attached to it, but then that's just because I'm a cheeseburger fan. But seriously, when you put up digital content, whether it's pictures of your pets or whether it's a long thought out blog post or an email that you send, you probably have some notion about what you expect will happen to it. Maybe you want your content to go viral. Maybe you're really hoping that this YouTube video that you posted is the one that's going to make you famous. And you want everybody to copy it, embed it, and so on and so forth. But maybe, on the other hand, that wasn't your expectation or desire, and maybe you're wondering why this cat picture appeared on a Polish website. I've not actually had that personally happen with a cat picture, although I did find it a little odd to find a picture of one of my knitting projects on a Polish website, and I certainly couldn't read what they thought they were saying about it, which was even more disconcerting. But, I mean, the fair question is, how could the person running the Polish website know what I did or didn't want to have done with my content? That I wanted it to go viral, or that, maybe I had a little bit more conservative views of what I wanted done with my pictures. So, just a few thoughts in terms of where do we want to go with all of this, assuming that we think it's useful for the internet to get a little bit beyond the stage of we just deliver the bits, you all work out in meat space whether the right or wrong things are done with it, assuming that we actually want to support something a little bit more fine-grained in terms of capturing the content creators' expectations. What are the things that we want to do? Certainly we want to be able to express the intended rights, whether that's something that's carried with the content or something that you can look up at some server. We probably need to have some notion of authentication and integrity. I found this piece of content lying on the floor. What are the rights associated with it? How do I find that out? And then there's a whole question of, respecting the rights. Once you know what the intended rights are, do you respect them because you're a law-abiding citizen for some value of law and some value of citizen? Or, are there mechanisms for enforcement? But we really only have about 50 minutes left, so let's not boil the ocean. So even if we were sure that we wanted all those outcomes and we're not, let's recognize that we're a long way from there. And let's focus instead on how can we take a useful step beyond today's situation. So let's not focus today on DRM, digital rights management, We're not about, hammering people's thumbs over what they've done with digital content, and maybe we don't even want to look at enforcement at all, because we're not even at the point where we can find, if we are intending to be law-abiding citizens, we're not even at the point where we can find out what the content creators' intentions were. So can we find useful ways to articulate the intentions of the content creator with respect to the rights associated with the digital content? And if any or all of this is sounding familiar, good. We have been here before many times in many different forms, from the whole URI world, Uniform Resource Identifiers, which at one point included visions of uniform resource agents, uniform resource locators, uniform resource names, uniform resource characteristics, which is the URC here, metadata associated with digital content at a URL. We've looked at some of the ways to share or express desires to share or withhold information in concrete examples like GeoPriv. And there are ongoing discussions in terms of personal identity management. Is this really me? And what am I willing to let you know about me in order to be able to complete some transaction? Some of these things that we've explored have been more successful than others. Some of them have been successful because they were pretty narrowly focused, and and specifically they didn't try to boil the ocean. At the same time, I think that we can ask ourselves now whether we're at a point where there is sufficient interest in trying to assign or understand rights associated with digital content in order to move internet applications and uses to the next level, that maybe we can find some of those narrowly defined use cases and move this whole program forward. From my perspective, I think we need to pull together some experiences from different backgrounds, which is why the panel is composed as it is. I think that some of this we can learn from our past in terms of discussions that have been had over the decades in terms of applications infrastructure. Also in terms of the progress made in identity management technologies, in publishing. What is digital content at the end of the day? What is a publication? So with that, maybe it's time to put our heads together and think through these things in a little more detail. And I will turn now to our panel and ask each of them to tell you a little bit about their background, their role, and their perspective on this problem. And Glenn, shall we start with you?
Is this thing on, as they always say? I'm Glenn Dean. I'm from NBC Universal, where I work in networking and distribution around content. And I spent a lot of time going to groups like the IETF and other internet organizations to talk about content and sort of do technical outreach to bridge Hollywood with the internet. Which is a funny thing, because if you look at the internet, it's full of content from Hollywood and from you and me and all the other creators that are pumping it out on a daily basis. And so I really sort of spend my time thinking about what that means and how do we sort of tackle this thing. And so this topic very much excites me. But my background is as an engineer by training. I've been for many years, and I've worked on a lot of stuff which really focused around, when I look back, on discovering something, either on a network or in a system, identifying what I just discovered, and trying to figure out what I'm supposed to do with it. This seems very similar to the problem we're talking about here today, which is, I found some content, what is it, and what can I do with it?
Okay, thanks. Leif?
Hi, Leif Johansson. I spend, I guess my day job is mostly dealing with identity management. So being Swedish, an identity manager, identity management person, sort of, I guess, puts me in the Venn diagram of the country formerly known as the Pirate Bay and IDM. So I guess I'm the perfect follow-up to you. So I think, to put an IDM spin on this, in the context of content production, and especially content consumption, identity is a really dangerous weapon. As engineers, we tend to think of resources as needing access control foremost. And that will lead us to a world where we're always identified wherever we are, wherever we publish something, wherever we consume something, we're always identified. We're pretty close to that today, right? I mean, just to think of that library where, only identify where you check out the book, but, the shelf knows what you've been looking at, and the book covers knows what you've been glancing at, right? It's probably something we want to take a step back from. Now, I don't want to come up sounding like a complete privacy troll, because I'm not. In fact, I think that privacy probably, the ugly cousin of identity, probably there is a duality between content production and privacy that we should probably explore, because it may help us solve not 100% of content protection, but maybe 80% of content protection and privacy protection. I guess that's my pitch.
Okay, thanks. Peter?
Hi, I'm Peter St. Andre. Currently work for Cisco doing lots of collaboration technologies, but have also worked on formerly things like Jabber, XMPP, and I also publish a lot of public domain texts on a website that I run. So it seems to me there are a couple issues here. It's a very complicated space, and as you say, trying to boil the ocean might be a challenge. I think there's some educational aspects that maybe the Internet Society might take on in terms of educating people about what actually happens when they blog or something like that. They probably don't know that, oh, I posted this picture at this WordPress thing that I just set up, and now it shows up somewhere else. How did that even happen? So I think there are some educational aspects, and I think there are, to your point about URCs and identity, if we had better identifiers for what, lack of a better word, we call content. I don't particularly like that word, but things that get created, and because I can take parts of those and mash them up in different ways. We don't really necessarily have good identifiers for those things. And then to Leif's point, to connect those identifiers for things that are created with the creator themselves, I think we might be able to find some sort of tractable problem that we could solve here, because I think that's part of the point here of our conversation, is try to get to something that we might be able to get our arms around. And I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Great. Thank you all. Yes, we did that. These are the questions that were in the briefing panel description, and we may come back to that. But just to focus a little bit on where from here, I think we sort of described a couple ends of the spectrum in terms of, we have tried to do identifiers before. There used to be, as I said, there was a URI working group that had a vision for what we could do with internet and identifiers, and a whole panoply of related items. And it didn't happen. Parts of it have happened. We do have standards for some pieces of this. So maybe it would be helpful if you all could say in your words, since I've said them in mine, what you think has changed about now that might allow a little bit of forward progress, if not on the whole vision thing, then at least in some piece of the puzzle. 2 mics, three panelists. This will be fun.
You're going.
I'll go first. So I don't think anything changed, but I think one thing that we should probably recognize about some of that work is that I think it didn't recognize some of the business drivers that sort of was behind the, content explosion, Google, whatever. And I think that is what we need to correct. If we are going to have any chance of making anything work, we have to make it work in such a way that it doesn't break business models. In fact, it should create new business models. If privacy is going to be, and I actually tend to think of privacy, I know I'm definitely not alone here, think of privacy as, it's just another aspect of content publication. Right? I'm publishing my information to certain recipients, and I want them to use that in the way that I want them to use that. And we have to create new business opportunities when we build our protocols. That's the way we get deployment for it.
I think one thing has changed lately, though, is that more people are putting stuff out on the internet, and they're unwitting creators, perhaps, but they're creative nonetheless. We're not in a world any longer where things are, they're centralized in a sense, right? Because a lot of people are quote unquote publishing at something like Facebook or something of that kind. But there are also more people putting things out onto the net, and more things are being digitized, and therefore being able to be obviously just a stream of bits, like Leslie says, and easily copied. So that has changed, and I think we're now working in a world where people don't understand what they're particularly doing when they're posting this stuff online, and that's difficult. It's difficult to even glean what their intentions might be, because they might not even have any intentions other than having fun with cat pictures.
A laudable goal.
So I do think a lot has changed, actually, since a lot of the early work. You know, as engineers, we sometimes see where things are going before they actually get there. And a lot of the stuff that was done before was solving a problem that we anticipated we were going to have. Turns out we were right. We've got it. And what changed was that the people that are on the internet have started switching from being consumers to contributors. We all carry phones that can create videos in high def. We have editing software now on our laptops that comes free with the operating system that lets you do editing that a decade ago would have been a room full of equipment and untouchable by the average person. And they're creating stuff every day, and they're publishing it on the internet. What they're finding when they get there is that there's channels to put it out through, but there's no way for them to identify that this is mine. There's no way for them to identify what they want people to do with the thing. And in fact, what we've failed to deliver as engineers is a way for people to do the right thing when they want to do the right thing. We've focused on the problem in the past to deal with, commercial content and from studios that have, had the money and the resources to worry about how to prevent their product from being misused. But I think one of the changes is we're now entering a world where we want people to use more things, and we're all contributing to this. And so instead of focusing on the use case of how do I prevent, the new question I think is how do we enable? And how do we enable the guy who wants to do the right thing with my content? If I make a video of me skateboarding and doing something fun, and he decides he wants to put this on TV in Prague, okay, how does he even ask me, can I do that? That's the infrastructure we need to figure out and build upon. And I think a lot of stuff we did in the past is entirely reusable. It shouldn't be thrown away. We had good ideas. What we didn't have was a ready set of consumers and use cases for those consumers that took that and made it real. And that's what's changed.
Okay, thank you. Any other panelists follow up? Y'all like each other's positions? Want to poke each other?
Right. I mean, I want to just reiterate that I think that building these architectures is probably going to be a really good idea, but we need to make sure that we as engineers don't actually question our default position of, identified is always correct, security is always sort of paramount. Because I don't think that will get us the system that will serve all of the critical applications that we need, right? We already have situations today where people publish information that need to be made public anonymously, right? They may forego the opportunity of being contacted, right? And that might be a choice you make, but we need to enable those choices so that we're not, again, building the library where you're not able to look at a book without having that recorded.
Okay. And I think, again, back to the concern about boiling the ocean, one of the things that can seem really daunting, following that line of thought to, if we think we have to identify everything and every step must be provably correct and enabled and enforced, not only is it a very tough engineering problem, not only are there more corner cases than there are, grains of sand in the ocean, there are... maybe we don't want that future, I think is your point, Leif. And so assuming that that's not what we want, so we can't quite articulate entirely where it is we want to get to, what do we think is at least a first step to move ourselves forward? somebody else can solve the problem. Or let me put it a different way. I mean, maybe we, the engineering community of the internet don't have a next step. Maybe we wait and see when, some large company comes along and makes it a commercial service.
Right, I think that would be a bad idea because that would definitely lock it into an ecosystem.
Right.
We've seen that happen with large content providers, that it never results in portability. Now, again, that comes back to my business model comment, because the attempts that have been made out there to building things like portable contacts, for instance, which isn't really related to this, but sort of trying to break the business models that actually work today won't work either. So we have to, the engineering part of this will have to, from day one, take potential business models into account, or it will have zero chance of deployability. So I think that Glenn's idea of, let's at least make it possible to express what a content producer wants, and add a little bit of my sort of privacy wariness to that, is probably a good start, right? And it could certainly be scoped. Then you have to. Then somebody in the room is going to say, well, how do you identify? How do you locate these objects or whatever they are? How do you, are we talking notaries or something? Possibly. And for everything we're going to undertake here, it's going to look like something we've tried and failed at before.
All right, those are words to remember.
Let me go back to what I said at the beginning, that I think we solved a lot of these problems for different things in the past. I spent a lot of time writing code to find things, identify it, and figure out what I can do with it. Sometimes those are devices on the network, sometimes they're systems, sometimes they're applications. In a lot of ways, I view this as a similar problem. I think that the first step for any of these solutions is you step back and say, well, what use cases do I have? So I think one of the very first exercises that needs to be done is to sort of come up with a set of general use cases so as we don't boil the ocean. And once you got that, and I think the focus of those use cases is important. Again, it's a focus on the positive. It's the focus on enabling, not the focus on disabling.
Right.
And if you create those use cases, that starts addressing the whole spectrum of content creation, from the guy who makes cat videos to the very high quality, by the way, people who make videos that you see on places like YouTube, where it's user-generated content, but it's professional quality almost. And then all the way up to professional content coming out of studios and networks. And I think it's a spectrum. It's not a them and us. It's everybody. And so let's get those use cases. Then we'll start the engineering, because then we'll know what we have to do.
So, about cat videos. Some time ago, I came across a cat video. I think it was called Rufus Tower. Anyway, it's a cute cat video about a guy who feels sorry for his cat because he's had to give him eardrops that are apparently quite painful, but were necessary for the cat. So by way of apology to his cat, he builds a box tower for his cat, which is really cute because he shows all the building of the box tower and the cat running around in it, so on and so forth. If you like cats, I suggest you go look at it. None of this has anything to do with IPR. Where it does come into this particular topic is because as a backdrop music for his video, he said, I'm going to use some music from my brother's band. So he did actually use a recording that evidently his brother had made, the name of which escapes me at the moment, sadly. And in the credits on the video it says, hope you don't mind, bro. Apparently used it without permission. But fortunately for me, since I rather liked the tune, it was enough to actually look it up on iTunes, and I went off and bought said piece of music. So I don't know if anybody else was so motivated on seeing the video, which did actually go fairly viral. But I mean, I think it's kind of a point, it kind of underlines Leif's point that sometimes you kind of have to make a leap between controlling versus allowing stuff to happen, and maybe you have happy outcomes. I mean, presumably his brother is happy he used the music in the video if it sells more for his band, we can assume. But I mean, it's pretty easy to get into fairly complex use cases pretty quickly, and use cases where we kind of have to predict outcomes, which outcome would be better than another.
How do we start looking at use cases and enablement?
I think, Leslie, this person, I think it gets back to what publishing is, right? So I don't know where the guy got the music from the band, right? What, had it been privately distributed and he just had to have a copy because his brother gave him one, or was it out there on SoundCloud or Reverb Nation or something like that? Or just posted on their
iTunes,
website?
because I did eventually buy it.
Right, but I don't know where he actually, yeah, sure, but those folks,
Maybe he made his brother
unfortunately,
buy it.
the way, perhaps fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your philosophy, when you make things public now, they're just a stream of bits out there, and you can't necessarily have expectations that it's going to get treated in certain ways, even if you have some sort of metadata that you put in it, or an association with a Creative Commons license or something like that. There's no guarantee that that will be respected. So I think it's hard to manage expectations in the world that we're in, and I don't have an answer to how we do that, but I think at least having some ways. I put all my stuff out there on Creative Commons 0 license, because I figure once I publish it, it's out there for good, and people can track down who the original publisher was, because they can go to the Wayback Machine and search for certain text string or something like that. It's easier with text, and figure out who the original publisher was, and then they can contact me if they so please. But I'm not sure what the way is to do that for other forms of other content types.
Well, and I think that's important. For text, we sort of got part of it solved, sort of. I mean, I spent a lot of time working with open source code in my career, and when you try to create a product for a company that's going to sell that, I've always had to jump through major hoops just for open source code, even for code that's labeled clearly, this is open source, take it and do whatever you want with it. Here's a license that has extremely generous terms. And that's hard for code. Yeah. Even among the engineering community, forget video and forget, all the other issues we have with content. So, I don't want to trivialize it and say this is easy. But I will flip it and say it's important, because just like code, and who owns the rights to a piece of open source code, or what those rules are, that's an important thing to solve, because if you're a technology company, you want to ship a product and it runs on Linux, you have to answer that question.
Right.
If you are a creator who finds interesting music or interesting video or interesting imagery, and you would like to put that together into something that you want to create, you need to go forth and figure out how to deal with the issues of whose stuff is this, and will they let me do this? Because, again, I come back to the case of let's try to build a solution that lets the people that want to do the right thing do it. And if you want to create that, how would he go to his brother and say, I want to use your tune, bro? How would he do that? He doesn't have a way today. I guess he could call up his brother on the phone if his brother still likes him after he's ripped off his video. Hopefully that family relationship survived. But today we don't have a way to do the right thing. And so I think, use case wise, you step back and say, well, what is the middle point, right? And the video creation is, I got video and I've got audio and I've got imagery inside the video. For each of those things, how would you identify what they are, right? And how do I assemble it? Now we have ways that are being put on the table for identifying once it's all assembled. We have things like IDER, who, right now are being used commercially, but fundamentally, the technology, there's nothing in the technology that's commercial versus non-commercial. It could be used to solve the problem for everybody.
Yeah, do you want to spell that out for?
No, it's an acronym and I'll get it wrong. It's EIDR, IDER.
Thank you.
And it's based upon digital object naming that we use in other places, and it understands the concepts of this is a piece of work, and it understands the concept of derivatives of that piece of work. And it allows you to identify and mark it, and then later find it. And it solves part of the problem where, once you figure out how to figure out what the thing I'm looking at is, it then lets you have an identifier that you could then use to go look it up. And so getting to an engineering standpoint, now I have an identifier that I can stick in a database and I can start sticking data around that identifier. We still have a lot of problems though to solve, which is first identifying what it is I'm looking at, and then questions about privacy and identity, both of the creator and privacy identity of the consumer, and potentially privacy identity of the distributor along the way. I don't know if you want to sort of tackle that, Lee?
Well, I was actually going to say that I think one of the things that we've learned in the identity community, when we've been talking about things like provenance of information about people, provenance of attributes, it's a no-starter to change the wire format of anything, essentially. So, and that goes for that applies in this space to adding metadata to the objects is never going to work. So I think the approach, whatever it is, has to be, let's find some sort of identifier mechanism for content, and have statements about those identifiers rather than statements inside the content themselves. And again, this goes back to, yes, the engineer in the room says, well, that makes it impossible to, prove that, et cetera, et cetera. And again, I don't think it matters, actually, for this. I think that's part of taking a step back from getting perfect solutions, and just also taking a step back from the underlying assumption that there will be no humans involved in the process. There will be humans involved in the process, right? And they will be able to make, stupid or intelligent decisions. They're going to make stupid or intelligent decisions anyway. We might as well sort of not assume that they won't be involved. And the whole sort of how do you associate licenses to code is just one example of this. I'm not sure that's a use case you want to actually spend time on, because there's no people in the world who like that stuff more than open source people, fighting over licenses. I don't think you want to get into that, but
You're probably right.
I'm just saying. But go.
So it sounds to me, Leif, like what we're coming to is we need identifiers for content, and perhaps we want identifiers for creators. Some people might want to publish anonymously in some way. So, but if you do want traceability or the ability to have some sort of say or vote in how things are treated, you want to have your creator ID. You have your creation ID, your creator ID, and we just need to put the two together, hash them up, and we're done. So, thanks.
But with
Can we go
always-
now listening?
But always with privacy. I think it's
Yeah.
an essential part, because if we develop a solution that works, if you assume that I just want to reveal everything about myself all the time as either a creator or a consumer, that's not necessarily true. There's parts of the world where you don't want to necessarily do it, or maybe you're creating a piece of content that is kind of fun, but you don't necessarily want to be known for posterity that I created this, because the internet is forever. And everything you put up there is forever. And I don't know if I want my great-great-great-great-grandchildren living because I made a cat video and having to deal with that legacy.
Well, identifiers are cheap, right? I mean, you could have
Yeah.
pseudonyms, you could publish these things
Absolutely.
or anonymously, right?
Right. I mean, if people think that content identifiers are hard, I'd just like to invite you to consider magnet links, right?
Consider, sorry?
Magnet links. If you don't know what they are, you can ask your kids.
So before I open up the floor to questions from the floor, I want to press just a little bit more on this identity management side, because I think there's more to glean here than just identifying people and authenticating people and privacy in this context. I think there was a lot of useful thought put into questions of, if I am going to share enough of my identity or characteristics in order to enable a transaction, I want to limit how much you get to know about me, and I want to limit whether you can share that with anybody else, for instance. That sort of algebra, if you will, of handling the metadata around identity management, it could be applicable here as well. And Leif, can I put you on the spot to say a bit about that?
Well, it could, but you have to be careful about some of those applications that are actually real, are about and have to be about enforcement because of legal reasons, right? So it may, but indefinitely, there are definitely situations where you could go from what we do today. We try to figure out the minimality, right? The minimality principle in handling identity is a pretty well-established one. It says that, you don't reveal more than you actually have to, especially if you have a third party in the flow, like a so-called identity provider, then, that acts on behalf of the subject. Don't reveal more about the subject to the relying party than you actually have to for that application to work. Okay, so let's say we take a step back from that, right? That's let me call that the extreme privacy approach, right? Let's take a step back from that and say, I'm gonna reveal what is convenient, but I'm gonna use these other mechanisms to trace what I revealed, right? So I'm gonna view that as a content publication event. I'm gonna say that when I logged on to that site, to Facebook, and revealed this information about myself, I also told somebody, maybe Facebook, a third party or something, about my intent for that information, right? So maybe that doesn't help me with Facebook privacy settings at all. I still have to click through that dialogue. But it helps me because somebody else, somebody I can trust perhaps, could actually go check up on Facebook in the future. Make sure that they did what I told them to do, right?
Right.
I think that aspect of privacy mechanism, privacy management, has a better chance of working if for no other reason that actually enables those third parties to have business models around those things, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I can, Leslie, the
Please.
one thing we lack in that example, though, is portability across different platforms. If you use Facebook as your engine for doing that, and you go to G+, well, it
Right.
doesn't, and that's an important problem to solve here. I don't know if it's in this scope, but it really is an important problem to solve.
I mean, a lot of times we're focusing on regulation as a way to manage sort of privacy, and we see privacy requirements as an incursion into the freedom of the relying party, into the service. If it's Facebook or YouTube or whatever. I mean, they're constantly in a fight with the European Commission over this, right? And it's because we view it as a regulation, right? What if we could find ways of making it profitable, truly profitable, to actually work within the context of a privacy ecosystem, right? Because you could actually make money out of being a good guy, right? I think that's the kind of solution we want to find.
Okay, all right. So I am going to open up to the floor for questions, and I'm going to ask everybody to please state your name, just because it will help everybody in the dialogue. Go ahead.
Hi, my name's David Hughes. I'm a technologist. I've spent my career in the recording industry, and recently I spend most of my time on identifiers. And I think that the panelists made an excellent comment. I want to reiterate that identity management is the basis of the pyramid for all of this. If you're not able to identify the piece of content, I'm not sure I like the word either, Peter, but we have to live with it, then we're never going to be able to figure out what to do with it. And when we talk about things like cross-platform, we need to talk about persistent identifiers that will travel with the content. And without this clear identity management and persistent identifiers, we can't build on that. And Glenn mentioned IDER, and in the past we've seen the newspaper guys do ACAP, Creative Commons. I mean, it all I suppose in some senses, if the Creative Commons license is generous enough, you don't care who created it or what their other information is. But in most cases, if there's some intended use limitation, we need to know what that is, and that means identifying the content with a persistent identifier. And I think that this is the direction that we've started to go recently, and I'm hopeful that we'll make progress.
Thank you. Panelists, any comments, follow-ups? Perspectives on permanent identifiers
Yes.
traveling with?
Sure, yes.
I'll say that traveling with is hard because there's so many different formats and containers, and so potentially, we should maybe look at exploring other ways of doing things where maybe instead of traveling with, we have a better technology for identifying what is around something that's on its own, and then map it to that permanent identifier.
So there is one thing. The IETF had a BOF 1 or 2 IETFs ago about big data, and big data is essentially about identifiers and for content objects. I invite people to go back and look at that stuff, whatever it is. Ted Hardy, who is not in the room, I guess, was one of the chairs of that and has a lot of insight in that.
Okay, back mic.
Mike Jones from Microsoft. First, I'll completely agree that one of the fundamental things we're discussing is there is no internet identity system. There's a whole bunch of things which I can say to any of you that you would understand, which is I would like to be able to say as a content creator who can view and share that content, but without identifiers for who that are ubiquitously understood and implemented, that's not realizable. Then I'll up the ante one more time. We don't have a ubiquitous payment system. Depending upon the economic model, I might like to be able to request that people pay me 3 cents if they like what they viewed. Or there's billing models where you might prepay before you get to view. But because we don't have seamless payment systems between individuals and between principals, there's a whole bunch of content relationships that are just inexpressible. And these are problems that are actually in scope for this community to solve.
Okay, panelists, any comment?
I vehemently agree.
I'm actually going to unfortunately disagree. There is, I mean, the problem is that there is a de facto identity layer for the internet. It's called Facebook, right? And that carries with it
Really?
so much baggage, and we need to turn our heads on, really turn our heads on, in order to figure out a way out of that hole, which I'm happy to call it, in such a way that we get back to a situation where we have reasonable privacy protection, right? Reasonable interaction, reasonable expectations. Because the default will be that we're using PayPal for one and Facebook for the other.
Guess I don't exist.
I don't think so, Leif, because in my experience, having worked on, we were working on Jabber technologies early on, there was a dominant provider of instant messaging services. And we chipped away at them eventually, and their business models changed, and that became a less interesting technology and so on. Similar things have happened in other domains. So you can say that Facebook is the identity provider right now, but next year all the teeny boppers are going to get sick of Facebook because it's just about their uncles and stuff. The old people use that stuff, and so that will break down. And that now some other technology will come along where there'll be this big silo that everyone will use. But I think that I would be more optimistic about the identity space than what you've just said.
I'm not sure if it's optimism or pessimism. I'm just saying that we need to think about the architecture so that we're not building in what we have today.
Yes.
And your point that things keep changing, I think, is something we should bear in mind, because we have a legacy that's going to keep following us along. So in 50 years, the dominant platform will probably not be Facebook. It's not an official statement, but
The dominant life form might not be carbon-based at that point.
And so, one of the things we have to worry about, I think, is also our digital detritus, and all that legacy stuff we're going to sort of leave behind, all the millions of hours of video we're creating now. What's going to end up with it in 100 years? And that's scary.
Yeah, you had some numbers about just how much video content we're producing these days.
Yeah, I've got some crazy numbers, but I mean, they're without the hard numbers to pull up. But roughly, I don't think it's a big leap to say that we are, as a world, generating and uploading more video content every few hours, or at least every few days, to sites like Google and Facebook, than if you took all of Hollywood's content and added it up together on a per hour basis. It's crazy. We're out of control. We're content creation junkies.
All right, Dave.
Dave Crocker, the exchange that you guys just went through but Leif's last comment came as a surprise because it didn't match what I thought you were saying at the beginning. But the summary that you made at the end, I think, matches a point that's essential throughout any discussion, and that is being really careful about the assumptions being made. And I got up to pursue that kind of concern way before you folks entered into this, because I found some other statements you were making seem to have fairly strong assumptions that I'd caution against. We we sometimes try to be careful about being transport independent or other kinds of independent, because we've discovered if we design a solution that can be adaptable, we in fact we do adapt it. And the assumption that quote unquote metadata can't be built in is one of those assumptions that I want to caution against. First of all, if there's, and I have no interest in pursuing the topic of identity, not because it's not important, but enough other comments have been made. But if we're going to have identifiers and they're going to be associated with the object, that's a piece of metadata. Once you've got one, and you have to have at least one, you're going to very possibly want to have more. The distinction between carrying that metadata with the object versus having to go look it up other ways is a really big deal, because as soon as you have to go look somewhere else, there's a correlation problem, and we already know 2 ports for FTP causes problems, never mind the kind of lookup mechanisms you're talking about. And so it's probably important to allow the metadata to be somewhere else and be able to support that, but please don't require it.
Okay, and I'm kind of hoping that somebody's actually got a question, but any comments from the panel?
I mean, I think you're probably right? I mean, it's just that I think most of the DRM, the various examples of trying DRM, right, which is more or less about attempting to add this type of metadata to content, right, has led us invariably to, forcing people to use Silverlight in various ways, right? So I'm not saying that you're wrong. I'm just saying that experience so far hasn't been good.
And if I can sort of jump in here and respond to Dave's comment. I think it's not super critical that we, and it probably is even a bad engineering decision to say it must be this way or that way. And because black and white decisions are never really good decisions in the long term, in my experience. But what would be incredibly good for us as a community to be able to do is to say, here is a standard way or ways that it is done. It doesn't rely upon one engineering solution, but it is one of a set of agreed upon and recognized standard ways of doing that. Mm-hmm. Just like there are 2 different transports for DNS queries. If we need 2 different ways of doing, sometimes embedded with it and sometimes external to it, metadata, okay. But let's at least try to figure out some standard ways as an engineering community to do identifiers, do mappings, and ask the questions about what is this thing. Once we get the standards, then we can start building services around those standards. Right now, we don't have any, it's just chaos.
Okay. Back mic.
Ken Klingenstein. I don't know if there's a question inside this one either, Leslie. We'll see.
Well, raise your voice at the end of it. Just make it sound like one.
Okay. And I'll flap my arms, too. I think the conversation's gotten a little imprecise in blurring identity and identifiers. And if we come back to that crispness, then a comment triggered by Glenn's idea that the identifier needs to follow and be persistent across the migration of the object. That's not how it's going to happen in life. If you look at nano publications as a new interesting domain, what we're seeing is that the large object is not as important as the individual citations within the object. And I think we're going to see that kind of microcosm. So learning one lesson from identity and identifiers is that identifiers give us the ability to do bilateral connections, unilateral connections. That's a web mechanism to achieve privacy and other kinds of protections in here. So I don't think we're going to have a single identifier following the object. The object will have an identity and identifiers that will map bilaterally, unilaterally, as it moves around, so that we can maintain consistency of the object being identified, but have privacy and other mechanisms in place. Raising my voice. Comments?
Okay, thank you. Comments, thoughts, agreement, disagreement?
I didn't hear a question in there. I just do not.
I mean, I can, one comment that I have is that I was making a joke about magnet links, but it's not only a joke, right? The point about magnet links is that they are identifiers as they are seen as useful by the consumers, right? They're not produced by the content producer. It's produced, they're created by the guys who actually want to find stuff, right? And I think that's important. I think you're right, Ken. You have to expect that whatever the content producer decides to treat as the persistent identifier may not necessarily be the way you want to consume it.
Okay, Tony?
Tony Hansen. There's an old saying that that kids do not learn that stoves are hot until they've burnt themselves a few times.
Actually, that's a cat story.
Cats too, yes. So a couple years ago, there was somebody that posted a picture of his daughter, and it wound up being used in an ad campaign. And they finally realized, oh, wow, I didn't put any rights on this. I posted it to the public domain, and it's out there. Could you address the learning curve or changes that we can add to the learning curve so that the content generators will learn about those rights that they have before they start putting things out there or and getting burned a few more times? What can we do before they do it and get burned?
Thanks for asking a question. Any answers? Thoughts?
Well, I think that unfortunately people will need to get burned, and they'll need to hear stories about people getting burned, and then where the places that they put things will need to provide some helpful guidelines to folks about what actually happens, because I think people don't understand what happens. I mean, we do, because we're a sophisticated audience of technical people who have some understanding of what it means to put something on a website, but we've got the internet of everything, and your car is posting things online or whatever. I mean, everything's going to be publishers, and people are going to, unfortunately, need to get burned. But I think there's maybe a place for the Internet Society to maybe do
getting burned, which is a negative experience. I think a big motivator for people to learn might be when you have somebody whose picture does get picked up for an ad campaign to suddenly become, wealthy. Like, oh my gosh, you picked up my picture, you gave me $1,000. I'm, if you're 15 years old, $1,000 is some pretty good money. And so, there's also the success stories, I think, that will really motivate people to go, oh, how did you mark your content so that you actually got paid for it? I want in on that game.
Yeah.
So, since you brought that up again, Peter, I want to share the story that caused you to particularly think about users needing education. And no, it doesn't involve cats. I was reading a blog by somebody who has a blog on WordPress, who writes, a creative personal blog, and who was used to the model where, she's got a blog on WordPress, she understands WordPress agreement, and knows who her community is insofar as people comment, she can deal with what people are saying, so on and so forth. But was surprised when WordPress made some changes so it was easy for individual blog posts on WordPress to be embedded in other people's blogs without necessarily any particular permission from the original blogger. And in the first instance that happens, the pointer back to the original blog carries. Once it gets carried a second time, it doesn't. So her concern was, I thought I was building my audience and I knew who I was talking with in some sense. All of a sudden, I'm being opened up to all these other blogs, communities, and that's not what I want to do. I don't think it's a question of being necessarily wrong-minded in terms of what she wanted to do with her blog content. I think it's a case of she's using the tools that are available to her for a different purpose than WordPress necessarily assumes. She doesn't want to become the rock star of that particular craft. So I think it's a case more of there weren't the means for her to express what she did or didn't want to be done to her content, rather than just being uneducated about it.
And unfortunately, she might not have known what her intentions really were
Right.
until someone gave her this negative example. Well, I know it's not that one.
Right, which is probably a fairly common experience overall in terms of content stuff. Russ, you've been very patient.
Hi, Russ Housley. So at IETF 84 in Vancouver, there was this DSII BOF that had, so that stood for Data Set Identifier Interoperability. It's very clear to me that we're talking about identifiers here, and we're seeing systems that assign them to audio files, to video files, to segments of video files, to scientific data sets, and so on. Yet, we don't have a common scheme. We don't have a registry for the very many different schemes that exist. We need to use these identifiers in discovery protocols. We need to use them in metadata protocols. I don't want to repeat the whole BOF here, but the point is nothing came of that BOF. And so where is the energy in the community to actually solve this identifier thing?
So let me answer that. I'm not entirely sure that nothing came of that, but because there's been a lot of discussion in the so-called big data communities, especially in research communities around, that it's just that sort of community takes a long time to get their act together. I wouldn't necessarily say that nothing came out of it.
Other comments, thoughts?
Oh, I mean, at least one thing came of it. You just spoke about it. You brought it back up to this panel that's talking about this issue, and you said, hey, these are guys that have done some work in the space, and you should talk to them.
Actually, I don't think it was the first reference to it in this panel, but you at least identified it for us.
Yeah.
And I will observe, too, that you asked the question about where's the energy coming from. The good news is this isn't a BOF, so we don't yet have to answer that question. I'm hopeful that the energy is actually there. Having lived through the first generation of identifier discussions, I'd like to see some of those problems addressed. So last question is Dave. Real quick.
I'm 6EAF3244. Do you want all 128 bits or?
Sure. Sing them.
I'm not sure I could say them. That's part of the. I think that may be part of the problem.
Right.
I have a really sort of off-the-wall question here, which is because Peter mentioned non-carbon-based life forms. Do you think there are useful distinctions to be made between what people can do with these things versus what computers on their own can do with them? Or are computers always considered to be acting on behalf of a particular individual, and you apply the individual's motivations to what the computer does?
I'll jump first. I think that a lot of this stuff doesn't have to be completely computer-driven. And the reason I say that is, we can engineer a lot of these solutions as best we can. At some point, we get a human's brain involved. But then we observe what the human does when they take that next step. And part of the engineering is to then start automating that, start making it part of engineering to do what the human does. But it's great because the human will help solve your use case problems sometimes on the edges. And if you observe how they solve it, then you make things more extendable to the computer world, but you don't have to make everything.
Yeah, I was actually going at something different, which is, it's a big data kind of thing. The example I'll give, which is, you'd really like to be able to have people do computations on things like long-term electrocardiogram traces in a way that does not violate privacy and which can extract information. So you're less interested in the identifier of the data, not allow the raw data to escape. In other words, you'd like to make data available to computations in a way that the results of the computation are available without losing control of the raw data.
So actually, I think that goes to the difference between protection and verification that Leslie was getting at. And I'm not entirely sure that whatever we're talking about here should be about access control. I think it may be that the answer to your question is out of scope. Go figure out your own access control mechanism. It may use the same identifiers or whatever, but I suspect that access control is going to be so domain specific, so you're never going to be able to make something reasonably general about it. Right? Intention is different because there's a human involved interpreting the intention, which sort of goes to the other part of your question, right? I think there is something here that there is a human involved evaluating those intentions and making a judgment call.
So It is my sad duty at this point to observe we're out of time, so with apologies to the person at the back mic, we're not going to get to your comment or question. I would like to congratulate everybody in the room for having had an hour-long discussion about digital content and rights and not having fallen into one of the very many possible nasty rat holes. So congratulations to you. I have two last asks. One, as we return to the world of the IETF, would you please take your lunch remains with you since nobody's going to be cleaning this room? And two, would you please join me in thanking our panelists?
See, but I think that's so, from what I was going to say. The mind was